Good evening, everyone. I'm Michalina Stavisky, the co-chair of the Friends of the National Library of Australia. Before starting this evening's proceedings, the NLA acknowledges Australia's First Nations peoples, the first Australians, as the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and gives respect to the elders, past and present, and through them to all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I would like to welcome you here in the theatre and those who are joining us online to this Friends event, Provocations, arguing about history, with two of Australia's eminent historians. The Friends are also delighted that Dr Anne-Marie Schwirtlich has agreed to moderate this session. Anne-Marie has a long and illustrious career in the public sector and specifically in the world of archives and libraries. Anne-Marie is well known to many of you as the former much-loved and respected Director-General of the National Library of Australia. She is well qualified to keep our too eminent, rascally historian in place. I now hand over to Anne-Marie. It's time for provocation and argument. Don't disappoint.
Yes, miss.
Good evening, historians and history lovers. I acknowledge that that we are on beautiful Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, which has been cared for, celebrated, been the site of history making and featured in the stories and histories of its traditional custodians. Thank you to the Friends of the National Library for organising and hosting this conversation about history featuring two of Australia's most respected historians. This evening is an opportunity to think about historical practice and how these eminent and accomplished practitioners approach their work. It will allow you to probe how they see and write history. The format for our time together is as follows. I will introduce the eminents. Each will make some preliminary observations by way of setting context and perhaps launching some provocations. We will have 10 or so minutes of panel discussion, and then for the following 25 minutes, you will have the opportunity, whether here before us or online, to ask questions and provoke debate between them before we wrap things up. No brief introduction can do more than hint at the achievements of Peter Stanley and Frank Bongiorno. Both are outstanding teachers, both are public intellectuals who have brought an historical perspective to debates online, in print, on radio and television, and both are academics and authors. Peter Stanley retired recently from the role of research professor in the Australian Centre for the Study of Armed Conflict at the University of New South Wales. Between 2007 and 2013, he was head of the Centre for Historical Research at the National Museum of Australia. Prior to that, he spent almost 3 decades at the Australian War Memorial. For 2 of those decades, he was head of its historical research section and principal historian. Peter has published over 40 books. Yes, you heard correctly, over 40, the most recent of which he submitted to its publishers 10 days ago. His field is principally military history, both Australian and that of British India. Peter is nothing if not versatile, though, because his published output includes histories of British surgery, the effects of bushfires, novels, and a children's book. His book, Bad Characters, Sex, Crime, Mutiny, Murder, and the Australian Imperial Force, was the joint winner of the Prime Minister's Prize for Australian History in 2011. Peter was elected a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2014. Frank Bongiorno is a Professor of History at the Australian National University. He returned to the ANU in 2011 as an Associate Professor in History, having taught at Griffith University, the University of New England, and King's College London. He has been a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge and the University of Texas at Austin. Frank has written 6 books about Victorian and Australian politics, the sex lives of Australians, and the decade of the 1980s. He has won ACT Book of the Year thrice, and one of his books should have won a Prime Minister's Literary Award. Frank is President of the Australian Historical Association and President of the Council for the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. He is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He was elected a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in 2017 and to the Fellowship of the Academy of the Humanities in 2019. Frank was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 2019. All of that is to prove in what good hands we are this evening. And now, Peter, over to you.
Thank you. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Dr. Schwirtlich, for that kind introduction. I could have listened forever. I, too, acknowledge the original custodians of the land on which we meet. Now, it seems that we've been asked to provoke, which for me is an unfamiliar and uncharacteristic mode, but I'll do my best. I'm very glad to be here with Frank. Now, Frank and I normally agree, but I was delighted to see in the Canberra Times the other week that we disagree about the renaming of the Sirius building, and perhaps that will come up in our discussion presently. I'll mostly consider military history, not just because it's what I do, but because last week, as Anne-Marie said, I delivered the manuscript of a future book called Beyond the Broken Years to New South. It's essentially the first history of how Australian military history has been written, the great bulk of it since the publication of Bill Gamage's The Broken Years, which appeared exactly 50 years ago. So for the past 6 months or so, I've mostly thought and written about how Australians do military history. And this isn't really an advert for the book, but remember, it will be available in November. Now, it's hardly original to observe that the questions we ask, the ideas we favour, the books that strike chords reflect our society. And Australia now is quite different compared to 1974. For one thing, we've had another 3 wars. We've done a fair bit of peacekeeping, although that era seems to have passed. And we've acknowledged what First Nations people knew all along, that for the first century or so after 1788, there was a war, or a series of wars, that were all but unacknowledged in our history in 1974. Accordingly, our military history, in the sense of what we write and view and do, has changed. Traditional military history of the arrows on maps kind is still strong, but we've seen even more Anzac boosting in the bookshops. One of the chapters of my book deals with the rise of what they call historians and the pernicious effects of the nationalist populism, which is now so common. On Anzac Day, just the other week, we heard again the bogus Ataturk quotation. Thank you, Les Carlyon, because he fell for that con and he propagated it like historical chlamydia. In the past 50 years, we've seen several turns, as historians call them, to the turn to social history, much decried by traditionalists, but now unexceptional, and an emotional turn in history, and especially military history, which we can argue that Bill Gamage was a precursor of. We've seen a greater diversity of authors, approaches, and topics in history. And military history is now more diverse in all sorts of ways. One of the longest chapters in this book is about ethnic Anzacs. But paradoxically, those best-selling popular reaches are even more jingoistic than they used to be, certainly than they were in 1974. So I speculate that the long boom in Australian military history, which has paralleled my entire career, is now perhaps fading. We might discuss that later. What needs to change in Australian military history? Well, briefly, we need to decouple military history from the theology of the Anzac legend. We need to get over the connection between military history and Australian nationalism. That idea was understandable in 1921, but it's surely no longer necessary or helpful. We no longer accept that the Anzacs fought for a white Australia. Why would we still believe Billy Hughes's contention that Australian nationhood was born at Anzac Cove? We need to incorporate the Australian Wars, otherwise known as frontier conflict, into Australian military history. That said, I'm nervous of undue deference to the orthodoxies of First Nations protocols. As Henry Reynolds told us in 1982, there were two sides to the frontier. Remember his pioneering book, The Other Side of the Frontier. We need to explore more fully not just the experience of war, but the effects of war on Australian people, individually and on society as a whole. So clearly, Australian military history is changing. Over the past 50 years, it's changed enormously. And as an indication of how much it's changed, I'd like to read you a few sentences from the final chapter of Beyond the Broken Years. Who could have foreseen in 1974 that we might have several books on the sexuality of members of the Defence Force, such as Noah Reisman and Shirley Robinson's Pride in Defence, the Australian Military and LGBTI Service since 1945, a book supported by the Department of Defence? Who would have expected a book arguing that the Banker Island nurses were raped before being murdered? Who could have predicted that in 2023 saw the publication of two books detailing the misdeeds of a Victoria Cross winner? Who could have foreseen Don Watson's The Passions of Private White, a book about the positive relationship between a Vietnam veteran and an Indigenous community in Arnhem Land? Well, that's all to the good, I think, but what do you think? I look forward to your comments, questions and criticisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Frank.
Great. Thank you. And I'd also like to associate myself with acknowledgements of the traditional owners. All that talk of eminence reminded me that I guess once a Catholic, always a Catholic. I felt like a cardinal for a moment there. I'd be more Woolsey than Pell, but anyway. Along with military and diplomatic history, political history is surely history of the most traditional kind, at least by reputation, taking us back to Herodotus and especially Thucydides. It sometimes attracts criticism as the very epitome of great man history, as military history, of course, has at times as well. Yet politics, like war, has a habit of finding those among us who think we can avoid it. And in any case, political histories have come to encompass, I think, a whole range of activities that no one would dismiss as great man stuff. The activism of women against sexual assault, of unionists against aspects of the gig economy, the right to organise, the campaign to establish a First Nations voice, children's strikes for climate action, pro-Palestinian demonstrations as well as pro-Zionist ones, and yes, also agitation against vaccination and lockdowns and the pandemic. I think we had some here at the National Library out beside the building at one point, and efforts to overturn a US election by violently invading Congress. It's also, I think, the history of an activity that shapes identities in quite profound ways. It's sometimes said that in Australia we don't actually derive our identity from politics, that our heroes, and perhaps our villains as well, come from war or sport or even crime, but not the floor of Parliament or the platform of a rally. It's true that we have no Mount Rushmore, and it would be hard to conceive of what an Australian Mount Rushmore would look like. We'll need to be content, I think, with the more low-key commemoration registered in those bronze busts in the Ballarat Botanical Gardens, and perhaps also here in our own Museum of Australian Democracy. Ned Kelly, the bushranger, is remembered, but the Victorian Premier of the day, Graham Berry, is forgotten, and the judge who sentenced Kelly to death, Redmond Barry, is recalled for that and that alone, not as the founder of Melbourne's great library and university. But I wonder if all that's changing. What's all the talk of democracy sausage about, for instance? Is that not an expression of how we like to think about our political system and its relationship to our identity? We like to think of it perhaps as subordinate to the Australian way of life. however that's understood, but it always seems to involve barbecues, doesn't it? Rather than seeing politics as the director of our way of life. As I went to vote in the Voice referendum at, where was it, Weetangra Primary School, I overheard a couple just near me debating, as if they were political philosophers in ancient Athens, whether the sausage should be bought before or after voting. Should it be inspiration, a kind of a help on the journey to the ballot box? Or was it rather a reward for doing one's civic duty? I wasn't sure of what to conclude from all that about the fate of the likely fate of the referendum. But anyway, it was very interesting nonetheless. Does not the democracy sausage contain an implied comparison too with other places, and even maybe now especially the United States, where everyday civility and equity, this basic element of democratic expression, the right to vote, is more seriously contested than it is here? We might extend that idea. Our compulsory voting, our preferential voting, our fair electoral administration, our Saturday voting, the amiable chatter between rivals handing out cards on election day. Don't we here have a kind of package that has now, I think, become a part of our national identity? I can't recall anything much of that kind of talk even 20 years ago. Something seems to have changed. And to this we might add our Medicare and our gun laws, which are also now ways, I think, in which we differentiate ourselves from the United States especially. Do we have political folk heroes who've emerged to rival Ned Kelly? Perhaps not, but I think that Gough Whitlam and Bob Hawke have come to loom large as emblems of a specifically Australian national identity in a post-imperial era. One of them a cosmopolitan, the other a larrikin. Collective memory, I think, is doing its work here. Meanwhile, Bob Menzies remains a contested figure in cultural memory, a symbol of outdated imperial values for some, but for others, more favourably and positively, a representative of the forgotten people, the sturdy middle class who he addressed during the Second World War. There's nostalgia too for John Howard, among some, perhaps not in this room, I don't know. But he too has come to be seen as emblematic of a strand of nationalism, a bit daggy perhaps in that tracksuit, but also infused with Anzac pride. So where's Australian political history heading today? One of the biggest questions, I think, is how we write political histories of an Australia that's also now subject to competing sovereignties. I'd argue that the term post-Uluru history might be useful here, an approach to the country's history that recognises multiple nations, political systems and legal orders, and recognises that there's a deep time political history. One thinks here of those places, those arenas where First Nations people met, talked and decided in their own ways how they would conduct their lives. Structures that we know survived well beyond 1788, well beyond colonisation, and I think which we hear echoes of in all sorts of ways today. It also has to recognise, I think, that post-1788, these multiple histories of colonisers and First Nations peoples can't be treated separately, that we're dealing with entangled histories. It's not black armband history, by the way, sort of John Howard and Geoffrey Blaney thing. It's a story really of how settler democracy, which was devised to serve the needs of white male colonisers, could be put to work by others in the cause of resistance, by women, by Indigenous people, by Asian immigrants, and by others, right down to the present day. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Frank. I'd like to begin by asking if either or both of you has been provoked by the other. Now, we're going to build to a crescendo, so we're not going for throats just yet, but a little bit of...
Provoked now or in general by Peter?
By the 5 minutes.
By the 5 minutes.
This is not accumulated
It's not a
provocation.
cumulative thing. Look, the main thing I'm provoked by is this idea of question really, what happens when frontier violence, a well-established theme, I think, in Australian history that even goes back really, before those 1980s histories. What happens when that becomes defined as warfare? Okay, what kinds of histories emerge out of that? What kinds of commemoration or memorial? I know a word that Peter, I'm going to provoke him right now. Memorialisation. What kinds of commemoration emerge out of that manoeuvre? And this is a big issue now, of course, because the Australian War Memorial, I think, has decided that it's going to mark the frontier wars in some kind of way within the institution. But what kinds of differences will emerge, if you like, around that process? There's already been some really interesting work done. I'm thinking of work by Tim Rouse and Emma Waterton around the native mounted police, you know, those who operated on the white side of the frontier, the settler side of the frontier against other Indigenous people. How will they be commemorated? But I think there are broader questions as well. So Peter's comments really provoke those kinds of questions, really, rather than anything else. Yeah.
Can I respond just with 2 points? The first thing is that clearly the frontier wars need to be commemorated. They need to be acknowledged. We need to do it openly and honestly and face the fact that they were dirty and messy and involved atrocious deeds on both sides. But I think there'll be a difference in the commemoration of those conflicts compared to the conflicts that are commemorated at the Australian War Memorial, because they won't be done individually. It's impossible to commemorate by name, but it may be by group or place, but it won't be possible to a roll of honour is incomprehensible. So the onus is on us to find ways to do it, and ways to do it that will bring us together rather than divide us. So
it's at last that's really difficult, isn't it? Because we do have the names of, for instance, Aboriginal warriors who are a part already of our historiography, and I wonder how a figure like Tongalongata in Tasmania and others will be commemorated in that sort of context. Yeah.
That's right, they're emblematic, but they're only representative.
They are, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And that is a particularly difficult matter for an institution, isn't it? We've talked about various kinds of history here, but institutions' roles in history, it will be interesting to if it comes up in audience discussion.
I was provoked by I said I wouldn't be, but I was. That I realised 2 things from Frank's talk. The first is that I think political history is much more fundamental to everyday life than military history is. Military history is peripheral. And the other insight was that I realised, not for the first time, but afresh, that military history in Australia resonates with what I'd call old Australia, the old Anglo-Celtic Australia, and and multicultural migrant Australia often wonders what it's all about. But the people in charge of our society continue to act on Anzac Day as if it relates to everybody, and it really doesn't. And the post-Uluru society politics that you talked about, military history doesn't fit into that very well, and nor should it. I mean, military history ought to be. Wouldn't it be wonderful if it was a tiny fragment of Australian history? And yet it isn't, but it's not as big as some people think. Thank you.
Thank you both. Now, you have recently both commented publicly about the decision of the Department of Health to change the name of its building from Sirius after the flagship of the First Fleet. Both in Australia and internationally, it is argued that the removal of names, statues, artworks and buildings which are memorials to or celebrations of racist and or colonial regimes assists in reparation and reconciliation. What is your perspective?
Oh, I brought it up. Yes.
Go on.
Right, okay. Well, look, very simple. I'm going to read this out. We need to face the fact of colonisation. Of course we do, but we don't do that by hiding it. So that's one point. And the second point is to remember that the First Fleet is also a part of Australian history. So I can't get past those 2 points, and I would keep the name and explain it.
Yeah. So, look, I wasn't an advocate of changing it, but I wrote a piece in the Canberra Times that did say it's not really such a big deal. And I believe that. I mean, I first encountered this whole issue in a very low-key way. I was at, you mentioned the University of Texas earlier, Anne-Marie, and I was doing my work at the University of Texas and wandered over to, people probably know the famous, the famous tower, clock tower, because it was the site of a hideous, up to that point, I think, one of the worst sort of domestic type of gun massacres in American history back in 1966. So it's quite a well-known site. But what struck me is the statues. There were statues in the mall at the University of Texas, and on one side was Jefferson Davis, and on the other side, Woodrow Wilson, going up towards the clock tower. This is 1998. So before, I think there'd been really serious debate around this stuff. And I was sort of puzzled by this. I mean, I hadn't really done American history at university, but I'd done it at school, and I knew that Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, and I wondered why this modern university in Texas was honouring Jefferson Davis in this sort of way. I didn't ask the same questions about Wilson, I suppose. And very interestingly, you won't be surprised to hear that they're gone. They're now in the sort of American History Museum on the campus and have been progressively removed. And there were other figures from the Confederacy in that mall who I obviously didn't notice. I'm not a very curious person. But yeah, the initial, Jefferson Davis and I think Woodrow Wilson for symmetry were moved in 2015, and then the rest were removed to the museum in the wake of the Charlottesville, which I think is 2017, isn't it? I find that story a really interesting one because I, was surprised at the time, but didn't really have a vocabulary in which to ask the kinds of questions that I think now are, in the wake particularly of the whole Roads Must Fall movement, are being asked much more commonly and sometimes being acted on. My idea would be that, look, name changes happen all the time, and there are ways in which we can actually manage this in a way that actually increases public debate. I mean, what level of recognition did the building have in terms of its name before the debate, I wonder? I mean, did people recognise the Sirius, even as for most people, as a ship of the First Fleet? Possibly not. But, there's a term, a very fancy term that's used around, what's it called? Dialogic memorialisation, Peter. Yeah. Dialogic memorialisation, which is about, you can change the names of these things, but there are ways of incorporating a sense of debate and a sense of change within the actual monument in some way. It might be a historic exhibit or a plaque. Sometimes that involves taking things away. Sometimes it involves leaving there and just adding explanation. Yeah.
I would have left Jefferson Davis there with a plaque saying this guy ran the Confederacy. And not a popular view, I know. Yeah,
it's become untenable, I think, in the last several years.
Politically, it's untenable. But intellectually...
Intellectually, maybe not. Maybe not.
Sorry, go on.
Oh.
It brings to mind those of you who have visited India and looked behind most of the museums in India, which are statue parks for Queen Victoria. I think admirable reasons for putting most of the Queen Victorias behind the buildings.
It's a bit like, isn't there one, is it in Budapest or outside Budapest? There's a rather eerie park that's just full of statues of Marx and Lenin, I think. I've always wanted to visit that. It'd be fascinating, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to slightly reorient the conversation and state that you are both exemplary teachers and mentors, and you care passionately about history. Peter, otherwise you would not have presided over honest history, and Frank, you wouldn't be president of the Australian Historical Association. Would you care to hazard what your students think is the point of history today, and what do you think the point of history is?
You go first.
Well, first to our students, what would I say about them? I'd say that they worry about whether history will get them a job. I think that's certainly been an issue in recent years. Whenever we talk to prospective employers, they tell us they value the kinds of understandings and skills that history graduates have, but students worry that it's less vocationally useful than, say, international relations, which has been one of the, or security studies. That's been a great growth area. I'm sure you'd be a great fan of an area like security study. Didn't think so. So they worry a bit over that. But on the other hand, the stories, I mean, a lot of our students today are doing double degrees and, they're obviously doing all sorts of subjects. They love doing history. They love history, I think, partly because of its basis in storytelling. I think that narrative dimension, and we all know about this, the way that you can be flicking over a channel at home and suddenly you're on a historical documentary and you get absorbed in it because of the kinds of the storytelling that's going on, often with incredibly sophisticated visuals as well with TV programs. But I think there is an element of that. It has less of the kind of abstraction and kind of theoretical turn that they associate with some of their other work and other disciplines, sometimes in the humanities and social sciences. So I think it's that storytelling dimension, and they do, I think, see history as providing insights into their own world. I think they share that much with the rest of us, and that's certainly something that I believe strongly, and I guess one of the reasons why I did history originally. I think our students continue to share that idea that history does provide them with a better way, a way of, or a guide to grappling with the world as it is today. Yeah.
I was a research professor when I was employed, so I only had about a dozen students, so I can't remember what they thought. But I can tell you what I think. I think storytelling is I can see why it's attractive, and of course we're all drawn to it, but it's a bit dangerous because storytelling is a kind of an excuse not to analyse. So I worry about storytelling, but I think what's the point of history? I take quite a different, not an opposing tack, but a different tack, a sort of more ethereal track, because I'd say it's the way that we connect with cultures and characters and civilizations which are completely different to ours. Even in our country, earlier decades are different to us, and we have a desire to understand. Some people have a desire not to understand, of course, and to just believe what they want to believe. But those of us who take history seriously, and that's everybody here, I think regards history as a way to understand the world, and we value that.
How's it? I mean, the way you spoke then, Peter, you could be talking about, say, anthropology. So why history rather than, say, anthropology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the reasons, and it's a bit related to your storytelling thing, history shouldn't have jargon. I know it's had postmodernism, but anyone can do history as long as they bring intellectual gifts to it, skills to it. Whereas anthropology has a sort of a technical side. The social sciences, sociology, they've got theory, you've got to master things. Anyone can do history, and they're judged on the quality of what they bring to it, rather than on their mastery of a discipline, if you like. And so history, it's got a claim to be the aristocracy of the humanities. And I think there's something in that.
Yeah, I was sort of raised in this. I mean, I did my undergraduate in the Department of History at Melbourne, and it had it would be fair to say, it had a pretty robust view of its own general importance in Australian culture, and sent its kind of graduates out to universities elsewhere, usually after a period at Balliol, Oxford or something. And there was this kind of idea that history had, it was the kind of, in fact, they would have gone, the prince probably, they would have said, and that it offered the deepest possible insights into the human condition and maybe even the meaning of life. Now, people in this room, we're quite totally familiar with this discourse because surely its most spectacular product in that sort of line was Professor Manning Clark, I would have thought. Yeah. But you get a sense of it even with someone like Geoffrey Blainey, who had an article I noticed in The Australian a few weeks ago on Taylor Swift. The idea being...
Historians can comment on anything. Historians can comment on anything.
They can comment on anything. That you kind of, because, kind of the world is everything sort of can be encompassed by the historical view. That Taylor Swift can be analysed, as he put it, She's very tall, like a Collingwood 6-footer, I believe he pointed out. And I've sometimes thought of my career as a historian as 30 years in the development of a better sense of proportion, actually. Because I don't believe a lot of that. I believe it's very important. And what I like to take from that legacy is that history is important. It does have deep insights to offer if it's done well, that historians matter for democracies, that an historical understanding of some kind is important in, kind of, what would you call it, citizenship, I suppose, or in playing a kind of significant role in society, but without perhaps some of the more romantic conceits, I think, that you find in that view, that kind of the idea of almost the historian as a kind of social prophet, which I do reject, actually. Yeah.
Peter, I'm hoping that your comment about anthropology might well have provoked distinguished Professor Diane
He brought
Bell.
anthropology up, not me.
Okay, thank you for that discussion between us. And we hope that the discussion has you on the edge of your seats, waiting to ask a question. Bring on the constructive provocation, but please be brief. Please end your words with a question mark, and please do wait for the microphone because the session is being recorded. I am going to take the first question from Dr. Michael McKernan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schwirtlich, and thanks to the two historians of eminence who have entertained us so nobly. My question is, Peter, I think you know that one of the books you have written, of the 40 Anne-Marie mentioned, my favourite one, I think, is Black Saturday, which is on the Victorian bushfires. And in that you depict intelligently and very movingly a community experience. And Frank, in your work as a political historian, community is a core element of your understanding of how politics works in this country, including democracy sausages. Peter, you grew up in regional South Australia, Whyalla. Frank, we can't call Neil regional, but we can call it rural Victoria. Do you both believe that your deep and intelligent understanding of community comes from your experiences in regional and rural Australia as you were growing up?
Thank you. That's a good question. And I'd say no. My understanding of Whyalla as a community came from history, because I wrote a book about Whyalla in the Second World War and realised what a different community it was to the one I grew up in the 1960s, and was able to comprehend. I mean, this is the thing. What's the definition of an intellectual? An intellectual is somebody who can comprehend something they don't necessarily share or believe. So I understood that community, even though I wasn't a part of it, and in fact would have been excluded by it. But I understood it through history. And I think Steeles Creek was the same. The people of Steeles Creek are not like me. You know, they're on fringes of Melbourne, they have wineries and things, hobby farms. I don't do that. But I could understand them as they explained Black Saturday to me, and as I was then able to explain it back to them. It was bizarre that I turned up and said, "What happened?" And they said, "Oh, we were hoping you'd tell us that." So, but eventually we worked it out between us. And you're right, it is all about community. Those histories are all about community. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mark. I mean, I was born in Nil in the Wimmera and went back very often because we had obviously grandparents and the rest there. But I mainly grew up in a working class ethnic suburb of Melbourne, now thoroughly gentrified, Thornbury. In fact, I think High Street, Northcote, was recently voted as the hippest street in the world, they said. I'll tell you what. Didn't look too hip to me in about 1977. But anyway... And certainly growing up in that particular community has been critical in my formation. And it was a very bounded, often limited place, I have to say, in the sense that most of the people I associated with were Catholic. Going back to the joke earlier, were Catholic. And I wouldn't have encountered significant numbers of people who were not Catholics until university, actually. But it was also ethnic. It was, the Italian presence in that part of Melbourne was still absolutely dominant and only gradually giving way to other. I mean, there was a growing Greek presence, but the Italian presence was very, very powerful. And that certainly gave me a particular perspective, entangled as it was in my own family experience. I mean, I grew up in a house with Australian-born parents, both of Italian origin. But we had relatives on both sides. We had relatives behind us. It was extraordinary. I mean, it was a extended family sitting on about 5 or 6 blocks of homes in this area, this single area, with often gates going between the different places. So, in that sense, yes. I mean, I think that was very important. But that's suburban Melbourne rather than rural. But perhaps the differences aren't as great as we sometimes think in these matters.
Just while you're looking for the next question,
No, it's
I didn't meet Catholics until I came to university.
There you go.
So, yeah.
There you go. There you go.
Hello. What are some of your least favourite Australian history publications of the 21st century?
Well, I wouldn't read them if I suspected I wasn't going to like them.
I read them because I don't like them.
Yeah, well, you just, yes, professional reasons,
Yeah.
I guess, yeah.
Well, it's no surprise that I'm not keen on historians. And just last week, the next book I'm writing is about an incident that happened in France in 1918. It just happens that one of the historians, Peter Fitzsimons, wrote a book in which he devoted 3 pages to this incident, and I can't tell you the number of mistakes I picked in those 3 pages, and the fact that he invented it, I won't say he imagined it, but he invented it, aroused all the ire that I feel for people who do not reflect what went on in history, but reflect their own, impose their own views of that history, use that history to create a view which, in my view, isn't authentic. So there are good historians, there are good journalists who write good books. Peter Rees, for example, Paul Ham, Paul Daly, but there are also people who aren't historians, but who use history for their purposes. And Peter Fitzsimons is one of my bête noire.
It's interesting, but I mean, I mentioned Manning Clark before, and some of the same criticisms were made of him. I mean, obviously there were criticisms made of accuracy of this and that, but that's not what I have in mind. There were criticisms made that he crossed, at times at least, crossed some boundary that historians shouldn't cross in terms of character development, for instance. I mean, he clearly used the techniques of a realist novelist in developing his accounts of John MacArthur or whoever it happened to be, right through to Menzies and Evatt in the last volume. But it seems to me, without commenting on that particular case you mentioned, Peter, that it is a grey area, isn't it? Because, if you don't do some of the things that novelists do, if there isn't a kind of fictive dimension to one's historical writing, it gets pretty dull. In fact, in answer to your question, it would be those histories that sort of don't really move beyond the antiquarian, are thoroughly descriptive, that don't engage with the reader in terms of storytelling and character development. But where that line sits is a very difficult one. We kind of, I suppose, a training in history gives you certain ideas about where you think it is, but I find myself occasionally being challenged. Has this historian gone too far? Have they crossed the line that I don't think they should have? I think it remains a very difficult, and perhaps, as Tom Griffiths has argued, a creative space. It's a bit of a dance, really, in a way, that around that line.
Yeah.
Yes,
Right at the back.
Can you hear? Yeah. I'd like to know why the Australian establishment, from the War Memorial through to the general run of historians, why did they have such a great difficulty in putting together an honest and truthful account of Agent Orange in the history of the Vietnam War?
I urge you to read chapter 31 of my forthcoming book. But in default of that, you could read Peter Yule's book, the title of which has escaped me. But it deals extensively with the debacle that was the medical volume of the Vietnam history. And I think we've talked about Manning Clark and the way he pointed at human flaws. And I think human flaws are at the heart of that failure to grasp the magnitude and the real significance of Agent Orange. And it's a tragic story of an historian who was somehow gulled into not understanding what really happened and was allowed to record in an official history something that sadly was tragically, grossly inaccurate. And it wasn't until after he was dead that came out. And I refer to an historian that we both revere, Barry Smith from ANU. Yeah. But Peter Yule's book really gives you the answer to that question.
But did the political stuff really override the historical?
Oh, no, I don't think it was a conspiracy or anything like that. No, I think it was, it really was. Yeah. See, but we don't use technical terms in history.
And I would have thought the whole issue is shaped by the fact that there was a community of veterans who had suffered, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, that's one of the contexts in which historians more generally are often working, that there is a community of people who feel a very strong personal connection to a certain past and will be deeply wounded if, you know, the kinds of histories that are being produced are inaccurate or sometimes, in some instances, are in fact accurate but don't, you know, meet the needs of that community. You know, the political, again, a very difficult area. It's clearly not the role of historians simply to produce propaganda for this or that political cause, but we do operate within a context in which people suffer, a context in which there are gross inequalities, and historians are constant. I mean, it's a very big area, Indigenous history, of course. You know, we're constantly negotiating those sorts of conflicts and tensions, and it can lead to big blow-ups and great difficulties. I mean, I think there were different issues operating in Agent Orange, but one of the common elements is that there was a community there who had suffered.
Yeah,
who had suffered.
advocated.
Oh, it's interesting that you just mentioned Indigenous history. I believe, Professor Stanley, that you twice mentioned the idea of both sides of the frontier wars. I'm not quite sure how history is going to actually be able to handle that. What kind of research and what kind of writing and what kind of perspective is going to make that possible?
Thank you. Call me Peter. Yeah, look, it is a matter of both sides. Of course, one of the problems is that masses of evidence basically are from the European side. So it's going to require, no, but it's not a matter of how the future will record this. It's already happening that the historians who are writing about the Australian wars, as Rachel Perkins calls them, have already brought to it discrimination and forgiveness and understanding and empathy and breadth and span. You know, that they... All of the qualities that you get in the best historians are already apparent in the people who have grappled with that tremendously difficult subject, tragedy of frontier violence. So I think we just need to see more of the same, but it's going to require those same qualities among the people who read that history. People are going to have to accept really uncomfortable stuff. And the reception that David Marr's book, Killing Countries, received in the last year suggests to me that Australians are ready to hear those truths and to extend that capacity to just listen and accept that these things happened. But it's going to require an awful lot of those qualities. Thank you.
Do I have anything to add to that? I'm, perhaps because I'm a political historian, I'm a bit, I think, less optimistic than Peter about how this is all going to work. I think that, you know, we're obviously dealing with peoples who were defending their country and who suffered enormously in that process of resistance to colonisers. And I think locating that particular story within a national institution, for instance, that really was designed for a different kind of warfare. I mean, it was designed really to commemorate the First World War. It wasn't even designed for the Second, it was the First World War. I think will be a politically very, very fraught process. I really do.
It will, but running away from it's not the answer.
We shouldn't run away from it, but it's going to take a lot of talking and listening, I think, to work that one through.
Yeah.
And courage, yes. It will take people. It'll be very important that people in positions of leadership are willing to lose skin from time to time, and we know that doesn't always happen within the Canberra bureaucracy, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Now, there is a question towards the back, then gentleman in the third row, Michael, you, and Diane.
Thank you, and thank you to the friends. In a full reveal, I'm one of the committee members, and it's just fabulous to see such a wonderful turnout this evening. And thank you very much to our eminent professors for your attendance and participation. A long time ago, as a secondary school student in an all-girls Catholic school in Melbourne, a fabulous history teacher drumming up support to enrol in her class made a statement that stayed with me for a very long time, and I'm interested in the reaction it may provoke from the panel tonight. And the statement went like this: girls, come and join me and learn about history. It's so fabulous. But it's time we learned far more about her story. Thank you.
I can't disagree.
No, it's not a very provocative question.
I can't disagree. Women's history in this country emerged as really in the kind of context I was just describing before, I think, in the 1970s, in the context of a new feminism, of women's liberation movement, a women's liberation movement that sometimes wasn't terribly conscious, I think, of the older feminisms that had also shaped the history of this country. And one of the great projects of women's history and gender history in this country has actually been to recover those earlier traditions. And I guess in my own work as a bloke, writing a general political history of Australia recently, I was conscious of a real tension because I wanted to talk about parliaments and the states and governments, which of course tends to push you in the direction of a rather blokey kind of history. But I was also aware, I was conscious of the ways in which this political system, as I said earlier right at the beginning, designed really for white men and with a strongly masculine culture that we have seen in operation in this town in recent years, in some very stark and disturbing ways, the way in which that political system did, from a very early stage, open up spaces for women's politics. And I talk about that, a number of examples from the colonial period in that book, Dreamers and Schemers. And so I probably wouldn't have asked those questions if not for the pioneering work done by generations of feminist historians from the early mid-1970s onwards. So I think it's a very important point you make.
Can I just add, pioneering work, Marina Larson wrote a terrific book called Shattered Anzacs, which was basically about the psychic and physical wounds inflicted on diggers in the Great War and what happened to them in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And what she showed was that the burden of care for those men wasn't carried by the repat, it was carried by the women in their family, their sisters and their mothers and their wives. And I mentioned that one of the things that we face, the challenge, is to show the effects of war, not just the experience of war. And that's a great example where there's a lot more to be done to understand how war affected everybody that was brought into contact with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, I just want to pick up on your reference to killing for country. I wonder, if I can be provocative, whether your suggestion that the success of Killing for Country is a signal that Australia is ready to actually hear and deal with this. Whether that really is just a self-satisfied feeling which goes down very well in the Canberra bubble.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your evidence for it.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I knock around with people who read that sort of book, and we all agree. You're right, there's millions of people, many of them voted no last year. Yeah, of course. I don't know how well it did in central Queensland, where those killings occurred. I have a small story to defend myself, though. Years ago, I wrote a book called Bad Characters, which was about naughty Anzacs. And I went to Bathurst. Before I published it, I went to Bathurst and gave a paper to the Bathurst Historical Society, you know, it was rural Australia, and talked about Anzacs with VD and who went missing, absent and so on. And I thought that I'd be run out of town on a rail, and I discovered that they were very happy to hear those sort of stories, not necessarily stories about their grandfathers, but stories about other people's grandfathers. and they were prepared to hear it if I could show that it was true, that it happened. I had the evidence. And I've got faith that Australians, and my experience at the War Memorial reinforced that too. We did a survey once and found out that a lot of people came just to use the toilets, a lot of people came to feel patriotic, but a significant minority came to what we call them truth seekers. And they weren't people who were like me, you know, sort of ratbag left-wing intellectuals. They were ordinary people who just understood that history was about telling the truth, and they were prepared to hear it. So I'm optimistic about that. But you're right about David Marr's book not being a big hit in Toowoomba. Yeah. Maybe.
Frank?
Yeah, look, I'd add, I think I'm probably optimistic too on this in the sense that a lot's changed since I was at school in the 80s, for instance. I mean, we did no Aboriginal history of any kind that I can recall until year 11, which meant that most students wouldn't have got any, because by year 11, of course, history was not compulsory. It was an elective, if you like. Now, that's not where we are these days. I'm sure there are deficiencies in curriculum, in this or that state or whatever. But there is an acceptance now that young people at school need to learn about these stories. And that's a big change since the 1980s, I think. So we don't really know what kinds of effects that's going to have on people's understandings and consciousness. But I do think that the environment has changed over those 30 or 40 years. And so I'm reasonably optimistic too, I think. Yeah.
Lauren, Michael is in the 5th row in front of me. Then Diane, and I can see you. And Belinda is standing sentinel for you.
Hi. Thank you so much for your erudition and entertaining expressions. I was going to ask a provocative question and realised I really don't know. So it's probably a dumb question in that sense. What about pre-settlement history? The absence of 59,750 years of history seems to be a little bit of an oversight. And I accept, of course, there is great anthropological work that goes on, but what about pre-settlement history? Why do I think that pre-settlement Aboriginal history was static and homogeneous?
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm no expert, but a few years ago I used to work at the National Museum with a bloke called Mike Smith, who sadly died a couple of years ago. Mike was the absolute expert on ancient Aboriginal Australia. And I knew nothing about this, but I admired and learned from Mike. And one thing I learned from him was that it wasn't static. And that it... Now, although I appear to have had a very caustic view of anthropologists earlier on, can I retract that completely and say that it's because of people like that, people with those sort of skills, that we can understand something of pre-settlement Aboriginal society. But I'm a complete layperson when it comes to it, because my view is not worth knowing. But I know that there are people who do know stuff and can guide us. And I also understand how complex it is. because all the sort of markers that we learn, you know, chronology, evidence and stuff like that, a lot of those are either non-existent or difficult to find pre-settlement. But Mike Smith's example convinces me that it's possible, and I know there are good people who are doing it. It's just not me.
So yeah, anthropology's been obviously important, as is archaeology. There's a field now called deep history, or deep time history sometimes, that is practiced in a number of places, including here at the ANU. Professor Anne McGrath at the ANU has led a project in that field. And really it's not just concerned with, you know, the pre-sort of European story of Australia, but also, you know, what that might mean for how we understand history more generally. It's also about, if you like, the theory and method of history. It's about the sources of history. What counts as a historical source? What about those stories that are held by First Nations communities? How can both Indigenous and non-Indigenous historians interpret those stories to tell that deep history going back 65,000 years. So,
or using the country as a source.
Or the country itself, absolutely. Yeah. Landscape. I mean, in a lot of ways, you know, historians have been doing some of this kind of thing for a long time. I mean, the reading of landscape was a big thing in English local history going back decades and decades. A big thing in French social history called the Annales School. They read landscapes too. But yes, it's being used in quite innovative ways and interdisciplinary ways. It brings together history and historians with anthropologists, with geneticists, with archaeologists in quite interesting ways. And it is producing new kinds of interpretation and all sorts of hesitations, I think, about some of the claims one might make about what Australian history, for instance, is. Yeah.
I think I said Mike Smith was an anthropologist. He was an archaeologist. Sorry, the spirit of Mike Smith. Yeah.
Diane, and then, yes.
Thank you. You've actually covered what I wanted to talk about. The provocation, thank you very much. The relationship between anthropology and history. And I think we borrow from each other and we create silos at our own cost. And you've both emphasised the importance of storytelling. And I think there is some exquisite storytelling in some of our early ethnographies that have to be critically reread, right? And asking that question that I think anthropologists ask and historians ask, who tells the story, in response to what question, and how is it heard? And as an anthropologist who uses historical sources and has just spent a lot of time in archives, thank you very much, I'm thinking very much about how we get from the local, that exquisite local account, to the national and then put it into an international context so we can actually have conversations across disciplines, across times and across cultures. Because if we're going to talk about the Australian wars, the frontier wars, we don't have World War I, we don't have World War II. We're still in a war, which we can see from the state of the closing the gap, jails, legal system, etc. So how do we conceptualise that? Right.
Thanks, Diane. I mean, and you know, I was very fortunate in being guided by Diane in the work I did in political history, because I knew there was obviously a story there that I just simply didn't understand and didn't know what sources to turn to. And looking at Aboriginal government, it was really helpful to have advice and to know that there were ethnographers, there were missionaries, there were oral histories that told the story of the ways in which Indigenous people had governed themselves. And very interestingly, I thought of it as a pre-contact story when I remember talking to Diane years before producing that book. And then what became clearer to me as I wrote the various aspects, the various chapters of it, is that it placed later, post-1788 developments, in a new light. I could see the ways in which those traditions of Indigenous governance had manifested themselves in a whole range of contexts right up to the present. So that was very, for me, was one of those light bulb moments. And I guess I'm obviously a slow learner because I realise that there are many others who have come to that much earlier than me.
Thank you. I'd like to ask both speakers about the significance of terminology. You've both referred to the frontier wars, although there's been later reference to the Australian War. If we think in terms of what happened as a British invasion in which people of Australia were massacred, should we, as we normally do, refer to a war by reference to one or other of the parties, the British War or the Australian War? Does the terminology frontier wars somehow demean or diminish the significance of these wars? Is terminology significant?
Well, there's many. Sorry, I'm just jumping in there because it's wars.
Go.
I don't really care about words, but it seems to me that
Peter, words matter.
words matter. Yes, words do matter. Sorry, I've lost you. Where are you? There you are. I don't think we can call them, say, the British wars. We used to call the South African War the Boer War as if it was the Boers' fault. We used to call it the Burma Wars as if it was the Burmese fault, when in fact they were invaded 3 times. So it is crucial what we call these wars. And I like frontier wars because it describes where it happened. It doesn't ascribe any blame. I like Australian wars even more because it tells you which frontier, the Australian frontier. And I don't think there's another equivalent of, for example, Anglo-Boer War. What are we going to call it? The Anglo-Wiradjuri War? But there's 100 other little wars that went on across the continent as settlement advanced. So we've got to find a term that does justice to what happened and which doesn't ascribe blame, and which identifying protagonists is impossible. So that's why I used to like frontier wars, but now I really like Australian wars. And I've got a contract for a future book on the Australian wars. And now I've got to write it because I've told you about it.
I've got, I guess, a little bit to add there. I mean, there has been a bit of experimentation with language in the way that you're suggesting there, Ernst. I mean, I think of Inga Clendinen's decision in her book many years ago, Dancing with Strangers, to refer to Indigenous people as Australians and to refer to the newcomers as British, if I remember rightly, British and Australians, which was a very interesting and unsettling language to use. And it's not, I don't think it's caught on.
No, but it works in 1788, but it doesn't work in 1850.
Yes, yeah, sure,
so,
yes, yeah. So that was kind of interesting. On the frontier aspect of this, I mean, there is a critique. Peter probably knows more about this than I do, but military historians of the frontier violence, like Stephen Gapps, have questioned whether the frontier is a useful concept because it kind of implies a sort of line, doesn't it? And there's this. I mean, think of the Henry Reynolds. There's this side of the frontier, and there's the other side of the frontier. What Gapps showed, for instance, in his book on the Sydney Wars, that early period, is that it's not like that at all. It's sort of there isn't really a clear frontier. It's much messier. Frontier kind of doesn't capture the actual material reality of those conflicts in those early years, and probably the later ones as well. So there has been some interesting stuff. On the whole British thing, I taught British students Australian history a few years ago, and one of the questions I would often ask at this point in the course is, why does this story seem to belong to Australians in a way that I don't think you think belongs to you? And it's an interesting, I wonder, I mean, that's now 15 or 20 years ago, 15 odd years ago. I wonder how they might respond to that now in the wake of all those debates about empire and violence that have been occurring in Britain and the US and all the rest, compared to back in 2007, 8, 9, when I first asked that sort of question. And I think they did see that it didn't, they felt then it probably wasn't very much, something in their consciousness that they were conscious of as a British history. It was an Australian history. I wonder if that's still the case. I don't know.
I've got a fear that conservative people will say, yeah, they happened, but they were British, it was their fault, and shift the blame. Whereas as Australians, I think we need to acknowledge that it happened in our country. Yeah. Good question. We
have used all our time and a little bit more, so I apologise.
Oh, this would be worth having.
I wanted to say thank you, all of you, for your spirited and clever questioning. And can I say to Frank and Peter that it's been a joy to be part of your animated ruminations, and we've covered so much territory, it's impossible to summarise in any meaningful way. But it has been a delight. And Michelina, thank you for opening the session so graciously and beautifully. I hand over to you to close it.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I think the evening didn't disappoint, and we could probably have stayed for much longer, and many of the questions that were asked and the answers given required, I think, or could have gone on for much time. Before I heap more praise on our eminence, I would like to thank you as the audience, and I'd like to do what Anne-Marie taught me some time ago, is to make a plug. I want to encourage people here who are not members of or haven't joined the Friends to think about joining, to be able to become part of the community that we have, and to be able to attend various functions here and support the National Library of Australia. There are brochures that you could pick up, and I'll just give a plug for our next event, which is quite different, or maybe similar, The Craft of Crime, which will be with Chris Hammer and Solari Gentile. So we'll have a very good event, I think, coming up in June. I'd like to also quickly thank the staff who have stayed and provided all of the support for this event to occur. And finally, I'd like to say a very big thank you to Anne-Marie, Peter and Frank for a thought-provoking and entertaining evening. And we are indeed, I think, lucky to have had such an intellectual conversation. It often is fairly flimsy sometimes in some of these events, but I think it's been very thought-provoking. And I think it was done in such good humour and with good fun, as well as quite a lot of intellectual content. They are true, and I'm going to elevate it one level, true national eminent treasures. And I'd like to thank you all for being such good friends of the Friends of the National Library and giving your time so generously tonight.
You're welcome. Thank you.